So the idea of doing this presentation as an evening entertainment after all of our lecturing, I was hoping would be something of a relief. In past years when I've come here and done Summer National Convention, there was something called Fun Night, which was sort of a grab bag and not always fun. So I'm not exactly sure how many people would think of Wagner as fun. So we'll see how you think about this. So the story of Wagner's Parsifal, based on magic lantern slides of a Theosophist. We do not know who created this series of magic lantern slides. It's in the archives of the Theosophical Society in America. Janet Kirshner made me aware of it, and I have taken her broad hint to see if I could resurrect the lecture and actually present it sometime to a Theosophical audience. And I'm very grateful to the board of the Theosophical Society in America that they also thought it was a good idea. So this is one of the magic lantern slides that we'll see. You will really get a tour, so to speak, of what the artistic world was thinking about Wagner at the time that this slideshow was made, probably around 1912. Music, of course, by Wagner. This is a German painter who did a lot of work based on Wagner operas, Braune. We will be hearing some music. It will be in a piano duet version by the other Engelbert Humperdinck, the real one, who was born with that name, who was an assistant to Wagner and created an arrangement of the opera for which all music lovers should be forever grateful, because it does in 75 minutes what Wagner did in 5.5 hours without voices. So if you're not an opera fan of voices, it's interesting to listen to this as a piece of music for piano. It's surprisingly how new age some of it sounds in the best possible sense. Luckily, there has been a recording of this done in 2013, and somehow there was one copy of the CD available in the entire world when I looked it up, and I was able to purchase it so that I could use it for tonight. So I'm using a script, and I've sort of co-authored the script with a Theosophist from the late 19th, early 20th century by the name of Ethel Mary Mallet. She was important, if any of you know about the Round Table movement that was important in early 20th century Theosophy. She was the wife of the founder. So she wrote an article for the Children's Corner of a Theosophical magazine called Mercury, where she explained the story of Parsifal for children in such a charming way that I thought it would be a great way to introduce the opera to you. And I had to write the sex scenes myself because she didn't do that for children. And the other book that was helpful was the Victor Book of the Opera from 1913. The Victor Record Company created many records of opera singers of the time, early 20th century, one side lasting 5 minutes, that kind of thing. And they created this book to market their recordings by telling the stories of 100 different operas with lots of pictures. And apparently the person who made this show had access to that book because many of the images are shared between the Magic Lantern slides and the Victor Book of the Opera. And again, I don't know who this Theosophist was. I was talking to Michael Conlon, who also works in the archive department, and he said that the slides were available to be sent out to lodges along with a script or along with a speaker so that it could be presented wherever it was requested. I know about this because early in the 20th century, Parsifal especially was of great interest to Theosophists and people in America. Wagner created it and built a special theater in Bayreuth, Germany, to perform it as a sort of sacred experience. And he wanted control over every aspect of how it was presented. And supposedly Parsifal would only ever be presented there. But the Metropolitan Opera decided they had waited long enough after, 1880 something, 20 some years. And so in 1903, they just decided they were going to do it. And there was no international copyright law that could protect the opera from that being done. And ever since then, it's entered the repertoire. Here's a sketch of Wagner. This is one of the actual Magic Lantern slides. He was known as the originator of something called Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total art experience, I guess you could say. Sort of like the late 19th century version of virtual reality. The idea was to be surrounded by music, glorious stage sets, theater doors closed, lights down. Wagner invented that, believe it or not. Before that time, the doors were left open for anybody to come and go, and the lights were left on so nobody fell over each other. And so he really was focusing everything on the drama. And dance would be involved, and beautiful scene painting, and so on. So he wanted to create this total immersive experience. He wrote his own libretto for the opera, as he did for all of his operas. And he was very much influenced by Buddhism in this opera, and also by the idea of reincarnation, two things which, of course, would interest Theosophists. And he was a vegetarian towards the end of his life. So just briefly, a few words about influences on the libretto. The King Arthur legends are involved here with the Knights of the Round Table and the Holy Grail. Also medieval epic poems, especially one called Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach from the early 1200s. And the philosophy of a 19th century philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, which was Wagner's introduction to Buddhism. And what influenced Wagner about Buddhism included the life of the Buddha, the idea of enlightenment, the thought of human life as sin/suffering. Sin's not so much used in Buddhism, but suffering is, but they're similar in some respects. And it's kind of a intersection point between Buddhism and Christianity. And especially, again, dear to the idea, dear to the hearts of Theosophists, the idea of renunciation and service as a means of achieving freedom from suffering. And the principle of non-harming, hence vegetarianism, actually plays a part in the opera. And karma and reincarnation as well. And then there are many Christian influences on the opera also. The life and miracles of Christ, again, human life is sin/suffering, the idea of redemption through service, especially the agape, the love feast that is now often called Holy Communion. And in this opera, it's considered to be a celebration of universal brotherhood and as a gift of healing for the world, ideas which were very strong in the early 20th century in theosophical thinking around the formation of the liberal Catholic Church, which was an offshoot of theosophy that Charles W. Leadbeater was involved with. There are many theosophical resonances with the opera. The Holy Grail is a symbol of the ancient wisdom. The Theosophists that created this set actually made that statement. Also, the Knights of the Grail as masters of the wisdom, and the Grail realm is a higher plane, which could be described as the Buddhic plane or the plane of unity consciousness. And then there are other theosophical resonances having to do with the path of spiritual evolution, as a progressive liberation from suffering/reincarnation or sin through service. And so there are various characters of the opera that represent these levels. Kundry is the only female character in the opera. I'll say more about her later, but she represents the level of aspirant. And then there's a chorus of male Grail novices who are representing the level of probationers. Grail knights who represent the brotherhood of initiates. Parsifal, who is an adept who sort of self-remembers, I guess, past lives of being on the path, but his process of becoming a spiritual master is the theme of the opera. And then there's Klingzor as the representative of a fallen occultist or brotherhood, member of the Brotherhood of the Shadow or a dark magician. Now, aspirants, probationers, initiates, and so on, this is all theosophical vocabulary that's been projected onto the opera by the interpreter who created the slides. But I think it fits pretty well. And then in this theosophical interpretation, there is what is called the outer drama, what happens on the stage between the singers, what we would call the action. There's also the musical drama, which is something that was intended by Wagner. It's what happens in the orchestra and sometimes in the voices. And the word in German for that is Leitmotiv, which means leading motif. So every character has their own theme, and every time that character is on stage, that theme is presented. And if the character is joyful, then there's a joyful presentation of it. And if the character is beleaguered by some issue, then it's a little more tortured. But also, settings get their own themes, different locations, also different philosophical ideas will be given themes. And then there is something called the inner drama. This is the Theosophists' edition, what happens within us while we're watching the outer drama and hearing the musical drama, the symbolism, in other words. I can speak to something of this inner drama. When I first listened to Parsifal when I was writing my book Music and the Soul about 20 years ago, I didn't know it. I knew of its reputation as being highly spiritual. And I listened very slowly over the course of a week, about 40 minutes at a time, and 5.5 hours. It was quite an endeavor. But I noticed that by the time I got to the end of the opera, I literally felt like something that had been divided within me had been healed, which is the theme of the opera. And so for me, it's a very special kind of magical piece. And I find the music very affecting, so I'm hoping I will not choke up in the middle of trying to talk about it. So if I do, just give me a moment. I'm okay, I'm just moved. So there are these books that will tell you, everybody played the piano, right? Back in the day when Parsifal came out, and people would want to know, well, what are the themes? So they could buy this book, they could take it home, they could play it on the piano, and then when they went to hear it in the opera, they would be able to participate in what the Theosophists called the musical drama. So here is an example. There are about 40 of these themes in this particular opera, and I'll play 3 of them primarily, 3 or 4, so that you'll be able to recognize them in some of the music that comes up later. So this is a magic lantern slide listing the principal leitmotifs. The one for the Eucharist or agape or communion, the Holy Grail, and the faith motif and the human suffering motifs are the ones that I'll play for you. The composer, 20th century composer Hindemith, some of you may know of his name. He was a German composer, and he was trying to write music that was different from Wagner's, because at the time he was composing, everybody was imitating Wagner. And he said, this is music as telephone book. And in a sense, you have a directory with all the different names, and then you can find out somebody's musical phone number from it, I guess. So the key to the inner drama is Blavatsky's 7 principles. The lower quaternary, so-called, identified with the mortal personality, is not so strongly represented. Sthula or gross body, prana or vitality, linga or subtle body, kama or desire does come through fairly strongly. And then the upper triad, the immortal ego, the part of us that is continually reborn until we are taken back into source. Manas, mind, buddhi, spiritual intuition, and atma, spiritual will, also play an important role in the Theosophists' interpretation of this opera. The opera is in 3 acts, and the structure of this inner drama, according to the Theosophist, is that the birth of intuition or buddhi or of the Christ within us occurs in the first act in the character of Parsifal. In the second act, there is the trial and development of intuition in the world of illusion, which we call the astral world. There's plenty of opportunity for the dark magician to create problems during that phase. And there are some elements of the temptation of Christ that are included here. I left those slides out. There are many. I'm using about 2/3 of the slides for this show. It would have there's a whole course here. And, in the time that we have, it wouldn't have been possible to show everything. And then Act 3, the crowning of intuition by Atma, the divine spirit. And as you'll learn in a moment, Atma is represented by the holy spear, which is an important part of the drama of the opera. So here are how the characters work out. Kundri, the young woman that I mentioned, represents kama or desire, but especially also kama manas or lower mind. She has this strange peculiarity of serving the Grail brotherhood, half of the opera, and serving the dark magician, the other half of the opera. And there are reasons for that I'll explain later. But the idea really is she can't settle on whether she's on the kama side, the desire side, or the manas side, the mind side. Then there's a character called Gurnamans, who's the preceptor of the Grail Knights. He represents manas in the sense of concrete mind that Pablo was talking about. And Klingzor also represents concrete mind, the dark magician. There's not a lot written about dark magicians in theosophical lore, and what there is will say things like they can never go higher than the mental plane. So I think, what it really is there's a highly developed intellect, but it's used to manipulate the objects of desire through magic and illusion, instead of Gurnamans, who represents the upward-looking, aspiring mind that Pablo was talking about. And then Buddhi, or spiritual intuition, is represented by the Holy Grail and the love feast, or agape. But also, within Parsifal, in Act 1, Buddhi Manas, and in Act 2, Manas Taijasi, illuminated mind. So there's an increasing. And then finally, the Holy Spear, when it's rescued at the end, Atma Buddhi Manas, and he becomes a so-called spiritual master or priest of the Holy Grail, the highest priest of the Holy Grail. So I'm not going to dwell a long time on this slide, but this is from the Magic Lantern slides, done in italic in handwriting, and you can see how carefully worked out every detail of this was by the Theosophist who was presenting the opera. As you can see at the top, for Act 1, the visible drama, so that's the action. Then you have the musical drama, so those are the leitmotifs that were listed in an earlier slide. And then you have what's happening in the invisible drama with the energies that are playing behind the scenes, according to the Theosophical perspective. And there's a similar one for Act 2 and for Act 3. Some of this I've incorporated into the script that I'll be reading as I show you the slides. So as I said, I'm not going to dwell on it. There's Act 3. So let's begin. There's a lot of backstory in the opera. I'll be going through that with some slides in the next few slides before I start the music. In the actual opera, these are things that Gurnamans explains to the novices of the Grail Knights, and it's quite long. That's one of the things about Wagner that people noticed was long periods of slowness and then sudden brilliant transcendent excitement or spiritual uplift, and then sort of back to an even keel for a while. So Franz Stassen made these beautiful Art Deco or Jugendstil portrayals of Wagner back in the early 20th century. Mont Salvat was the name of the mountain that the Grail Temple is on. You can see the Grail Temple way up at the top of the mountain there. This slide will return in context a little bit later. So here begins the story of Parsifal. Many years ago, there lived among the mountains of Spain a band of knights who spent their lives in devotion and the search for spiritual knowledge. This brotherhood dwelled on Mont Salvat, the mountain of salvation, in a beautiful paradise surrounded by a desert wasteland. The mountain was crowned by a temple that guarded holy treasures, a golden chalice called the Grail, and a sacred spear. The knights were guardians of this sacred cup of spiritual life, whose splendors only the pure in heart could see. The theme of the Grail is this: Centuries ago, the sacred spirit pierced the side of Jesus Christ when he was suffering on the cross, and the Holy Grail had captured the blood that dripped from this wound. But the Grail was also the cup that Christ used at the so-called agape or love feast, the Last Supper shared by Jesus and his disciples, which Christians commemorate in the rite of Holy Communion. The theme of the love feast is this. A king named Amfortas was the priest and leader of this mystic brotherhood, offices which had fallen to him when his father, Titurel, the founder of the order, grew too old to fill them. The chief duty of Amfortas was to preside at the love feast, when, with solemn ceremonies, the sacred cup was unveiled and its wondrous radiance filled the hearts of the worshiping knights with joyful delight and heroic strength. Okay. Amfortas committed some grievous faults and lost the sacred spear, one of the most cherished possessions of the brotherhood, for it represented Atma, spiritual will, truth, and knowledge. Not far from the castle of Amfortas and his knights, there lived a wicked magician named Klingzor, who was always seeking to destroy this mystic brotherhood of the Grail. Amfortas had, in the pride of his strength, gone out to do battle against the magician, but he knew not his own weakness, and when temptations came, he fell into the snares laid by his enemy. Klingzor called forth his servant Kundry, who brought about the fall of Amfortas. In a previous life, Kundry had laughed at the suffering of Christ on the cross. She was cursed to incarnate again and again until at last she could wipe away this sin. Klingzor's magic caused Kundry to appear as a beautiful, highly sensual woman. In her presence, Amfortas forgot his mission and fell into sin, selfishly seeking only his own personal, worldly pleasure instead of unselfishly seeking to overcome the evil of the world. Thus, Amfortas came under the power of Klingzor, who was then able to steal the sacred spear. Klingzor pierced the breast of Amfortas with the spear, opening a wound that would not heal. In great agony of body and mind, Amfortas realized he had fallen from the right path, lost the purity he once possessed, and was no longer fit to act as priest to the brotherhood of the Grail. Whenever he did so, the wound would open and bleed, and he would be left that much weaker. But if he selfishly refused to celebrate the love feast, no life-giving radiance, no mystic splendor would shine forth from the sacred cup to strengthen the Grail Knights and bless their work, and they would gradually fall into inaction, weakness, and despair. This is the theme of human suffering. And I just want to point out that it contains not only the tortured quality of human suffering, but also somehow a real nobility. To atone for her role in the fall of Amfortas, Kundry began working as a humble servant of the Holy Brotherhood. She searched the world for remedies for the wound of Amfortas, but none were of any use. Nothing could give him back his health and peace of mind but the regaining of the spear. Meanwhile, Kundry was still partially under the evil influence of Klingzor and could be summoned by him at any time. She was lost in the realm of Kamamanas, split between the promptings of illusory desire and the mind's striving for something higher. To the knights, the regaining of the spear seemed like an impossible task, for Klingzor's power was very great. Their courage failed, and they became distraught. Yet there was a legend that someday a man called the Guileless Fool would come amongst them, and he would be holy and brave enough to win back their treasure. That hero was Parsifal. We learn these things from old Gurnemanz, the preceptor of the novices of the Grail Brotherhood. Gurnemanz seems not to have a theme of his own. However, I identify him with the theme of faith, since he never loses his belief in the good work of the Grail Knights and the ultimate triumph of good over evil, the return of the spear. Here is the theme of faith, which holds together the whole opera and which to me represents steps taken on the spiritual path and the faith required to keep treading this path. One day, Gurnemanz, the eldest of the knights, was sitting in the wood beyond the castle, talking in sad tones to a group of young novices. He was telling them how times were changed since the days when they all lived together in peace and happiness, strong in the might of Amfortas, blessed in the visions of the splendors of the Holy Grail, and of his firm belief that one day some pure and sinless man would come and restore to them the blessings they had lost. But, continued Gurnemanz, unless the guileless one comes soon, my master, Amfortas, will be dead, and his old father, Titurel, the founder of our order, will also die without the consolation of celebrating once more the love feast. At that very moment, they were startled as one of their beloved and beautiful white swans fluttered down on the lake and died. At this, they were very angry, for these birds were held sacred and were never allowed to be killed. They rushed eagerly to find out who dared to intrude upon them and shoot one of the sacred birds. To their surprise, they found a stranger, a young man with a bow in his hand, who was evidently the cause of the death of the poor bird. When they accused him of the deed, he made no attempt to deny it. Indeed, he seemed surprised at their anger, for they were very angry with him. Gurnemanz gave him a great scolding and asked him how he dared go about killing birds that did him no harm, but on the contrary made the world more beautiful for being in it. As Gurnemant spoke, the young man's face grew troubled. His slumbering intuition, buddhi, seemed gradually to wake up. He realized, for the first time, that he had been behaving as the enemy to the birds and beasts around him by taking their lives instead of making friends with them and treating them as his younger brothers, whom he was bound to love and care for. At last, he burst into tears and broke his bow across his knee, flinging the bits far into the wood. Gurnemant asked him many questions as to where he came from and who were his parents, but the youth seemed ignorant of everything except his name, which he said was Parsifal. Gurnemant was interested in the youth and told him of the Knights of the Grail and how trouble had come upon them through the guilt of Amfortas, trouble which could only be removed by a man who was pure and brave enough to win back for them the spear from Klingzor, the wicked magician. Gurnemant further told Parsifal that that very day the brotherhood was to meet once again to try and hold their service, and he invited Parsifal to be present at the service. Parsifal thanked Gurnemant and accompanied him to the castle. First, they crossed a bridge that separated the outer from the inner lands of the Grail realm. Then, by a secret way, they passed directly through the mountain on which the castle of the Grail was perched. Parsifal was amazed that the journey went so quickly. Gurnemant replied that within the Grail realm, time changes into space. Thus, they were ascending to a higher plane. Suddenly, they were within the temple, where great bells were tolling to summon the brotherhood to their Holy of Holies. Astral bells, some called them. They passed into a lofty pillared hall with a semicircular table down the center. Last of all, Amfortas was carried in and placed on the couch prepared for him. He offered up a prayer, begging pardon for his wrongdoing and the sorrow he had brought on his knights. After this prayer, the sacred cup was unveiled and held up before the gaze of the brotherhood, who were gladdened to see a brilliant ray of light illuminate the vessel and shed its luster all around. Parsifal stood entranced. He did not notice the departure of the knights from the hall, and that all was silent around him. Thus he stood till Gurnemant shook him briskly, asking if he were dreaming. But Parsifal was not dreaming. He was pondering what he had seen, and went forth from the castle, firmly resolved to find the sacred spear and restore it to Amfortas. By this act, the wound of Amfortas would be cured, and the Holy Grail once again would shed its blessed light upon the king and his knights. So we come now to the trial of the intuition, Act 2. Parsifal went forth to wander in the world with the goal always before him of finding the sacred spear. But he sought it many a long day before he found it, as indeed all must do who search for spiritual wisdom. Meanwhile, in his gloomy castle, Klingsor felt safe in all his wicked power. Yet he knew that Parsifal was coming and would attempt to wrest the spear from him. Hoping to make Parsifal fall as Amfortas had fallen, Klingsor summoned all his magical arts. Astral form of Kundry to appear before him, commanding her to tempt Parsifal away from the path of purity, even as she had done with Amfortas. Kundry struggled to resist the command, but Klingsor's evil magic prevailed. That theme, dee-da-da-da-da-da, that's Kundry's laughter. It's what haunts her from that time when she was laughing at the suffering of Christ. Then Kundry's apparition vanished, and the gloomy castle sank into the earth to be replaced by a magic garden, full of beautiful but illusory trees and flowers, a riot of the senses. The temptations of the magic garden increased as Parsifal approached, for suddenly the beautiful flowers revealed themselves as an army of charming maidens bent on sensual enchantment. Flower maidens swarmed around him, attempting to beguile him into renouncing his high mission and coming to dwell with them in Klingsor's castle forever, in leisure, luxury, and sensual pleasure. Parsifal was at first bewildered, but when he denounced and repulsed the flower maidens, they retired into Klingsor's castle, singing a longing farewell. But this was only the prelude of an even greater temptation, the surpassing loveliness of Kundry, her womanly splendor enhanced by the magic arts of Klingsor. about his childhood, she knew of his mother, who was named Herzeleide, Heart's Suffering, whom he lost long ago and could barely remember. Enchanted. But when Kundry began insinuating that she could become a loving, mothering replacement for Herzeleide, Parsifal suddenly realized the danger he was in and repulsed her. This foiling of Klingsor's plan made the evil magician very angry. Finally, he himself appeared, threatening Parsifal with all sorts of evil if he did not go away immediately. But Parsifal, strong in his purity and good intentions, told the magician that he had come to get the sacred spear and had no intention of leaving without it. This put Klingsor into a furious passion. Raising the spear above his head, he hurled it full force at Parsifal. But a curious thing happened. Instead of striking Parsifal and wounding him, the spear remained suspended above his head, and he simply put up his hand and took it. Thereupon, with one great thundering noise, the castle of the magician fell down, and Klingsor was buried in the ruins. And that is the end of Act 2. Act 3, the crowning of the intuition, is next. And this brings us back to the Grail realm. One beautiful spring morning, it was Good Friday, Gurnemans came out of his hut. He was arrested by a groaning sound. Many years had passed. He was now an old man, living alone. The Brotherhood of the Grail had fallen on hard times. Amfortas would no longer unveil the Grail, since the sight of it caused his wound to bleed. He was near unto death, and his knights, no longer strengthened in their mission by gazing upon the Grail, had grown old and weak with despair. The groaning sound was from Kundry, awakening from the dead trance that seemed always to precede her transition from serving evil to serving good. Once on her feet, she took a jug from the hut and filled it from a nearby spring. Soon, a mysterious knight in black armor wielding a spear joined them. He was so weary from long journeying and many fierce combats with the evil doers of the world that he could hardly stand on his own. Mutual recognition came slowly, but Gurnemans realized in awe that Parsifal, the holy fool, had returned at last, bearing the spear that would make all things right once more within the Grail realm. Kundry, grateful for Parsifal's having freed her from servitude of the evil Klingsor, anointed his feet with water. Gurnemans applied a healing balm to Parsifal and named him Prince and King of the Grail, whereupon Parsifal baptized Kundry, and her age-old sin of having laughed at the suffering of Christ, the Savior, was at last absolved. The beautiful landscape of the Grail realm seemed to lie under a profound spell of peace. was the Freitagszauber, the spell of Good Friday, whereby the dark, turbulent oceans of human passion and evil give way to the flowering tears of repentant sinners. Such as Kundry and Klingsor's flower maidens, whose weeping would water the earth with redemptive rain, bringing forth the pure, wild beauty of field flowers. So that all nature would seem to rejoice in its springtide renewal while exuding the scented breezes of spiritual bliss. Amongst the stately pines of spiritual peace. After these prayerful moments, Kundry, Gurnemans, and Parsifal hastened to the Castle of the Grail. There they found Amfortas almost at death's door, the nights full of grief and forebodings. For old Titurel, the founder of their order and father of Amfortas, had died at last, and they were preparing his funeral rites. In the midst of the solemn ceremony, Parsifal approached Amfortas and touched the latter's wound with the spear, and at last the wound was healed. Thus was the prophecy fulfilled, that one should come in whom there was no guile, who should give them back their sacred spear and enable them to meet again for the love feast. This Savior, Parsifal, from that time forth, would be their priest and leader, for Amfortas would not take up again his old position. As Parsifal grasped and raised the Grail, a white dove descended to bless him. All acknowledged that one greater than Amfortas had arisen, one who had been tried in the fires of temptation and who had come out victorious. One in whom the spiritual intuition, buddhi, was fully unfolded, and who would thenceforward lead the brotherhood of the Holy Grail to even higher thoughts, purer lives, and ever braver deeds in their perpetual battle against the world's ignorance, suffering, and evil. As the Holy Grail of salvation through loving sacrifice glowed with unearthly light, Gurnemans and Amfortas did homage to Parsifal and the Grail. Kundry, too, was gazing at Parsifal in wonder. Then she collapsed, her long journey of expiation completed at last in this blissful moment of beatitude. Special energy in the room now. Thank you for listening.